Hey, folks, good evening, and thanks for joining me on Phantoms Monsters Radio. I welcome all new listeners and members to the channel, as well as first timers in the chat. Tonight, we're going to talk a bit about alternate realities, parallel universes, time mysteries, which all refer to the concept of multiple possible realities existing alongside of ours, and often within the framework of the multiverse theory, where every decision or quantum event could create a branching timeline leading to different versions of ourselves or entirely different worlds with distinct histories and physical laws. Now, the idea is that there might be countless other universes running parallel to our own, each with its own unique set of circumstances and outcomes. Now, currently, there's really no concrete scientific evidence to prove the existence of parallel universes, though the concept remains a topic of theoretical exploration. And it really becomes part of what we do in many cases, even though it's all theory for the most part. So, that being said, let's go ahead and let's get started.
Of phantoms and monsters. They exist among us, and sometimes they win. Even the devil was an angel once. The world has its own rules, and these rules are not human. Some of us seek answers to the origin and existence of cryptids and the unexplained. Join us as we venture beyond the known and accepted boundaries. Welcome to our nightmare. I think you're going to like it.
So, before I go any further, I want to mention that this channel is made possible by you by clicking on subscribe and like the like buttons, and by you sharing our programming. Now, if you're watching me on YouTube, the super chat and super thanks donations are truly appreciated. You can click the dollar icon located below the chat box, and the Buy Me a Coffee link and other donation links are also shown in the description. Now, thanks for your consideration. Your comments are always welcome. Tell me which accounts you found interesting in the presentation or suggestions for upcoming shows. Now, I want to again thank my chat moderators, Bernadette, Marla, Thomas, and Mike, for their commitment to me and the channel, as well as Christina, Kevin, and Mary at ESP Network. Now, if you're in the chat and have a question, please use all caps, and I'll try to get to each one of them after the presentation. So, this first account, the witness states, I was driving my wife, then fiance, to work one night, crossing a railroad track in our car. It was an older metal body Chevrolet Celebrity. Now, as we crossed the tracks, the roof of the car was struck by lightning, which is when the paranormal event began. Now, as the light filled my vision, I wasn't in the vehicle anymore or myself. I was somewhere and someone else. I lived that life day in and day out for what it felt like weeks, maybe longer. I lost track of the days. I went to sleep beside my wife one night, the same every night, and instead of waking there, I was driving at night and could see the end of the flash of light leaving my vision. I almost wrecked the car out of sheer shock. I didn't know where I was, and then it began flooding back. I was where I began. Now, my wife, again, my fiance, was completely oblivious to what happened to me and thought the lightning had startled me. Now, at the time, I was 20, and it wasn't a vision of the future because we had a daughter when it happened. In this alternate life, my wife and I had two boys and a girl. The boys were 30 and 24, and the oldest had a daughter, while my youngest son had a son of his own. My daughter, there was a senior in high school. It's tough to talk about this because for me, I lived that life. I was in my late 60s with all the memories and experiences of life. I didn't tell my fiance of this life because it took a while for me to process and grieve. I never got to say goodbye or anything. It was just gone, and yet still alive back in my life. What's weird still is a second similar mini event that happened when I was driving with a co-driver for a refrigerated company. My co-driver was driving and I was sleeping. While I slept, I experienced what had to be an alternate future. I was coming home from the road and greeted my three kids, our oldest daughter, the same as the previous event, and two twin girls, one of which is 100 feet from me. The other didn't exist to me before this event. The twins both hugged me, and I was so happy to see them. I remember saying how much they had grown in the last month, and in the event, I called them Callie and Allie. I woke up after that and burst into tears because I had an overwhelming feeling that I had a daughter who was lost to me, and I called my wife. Silence. She was shocked and almost whispered, and I could hear the tone of her voice that told me she was both angry and sad. She said, "How do you know that name?" What I had never known was that my youngest was supposed to be a twin, and my wife had miscarried one day when she thought she was spotting heavy. She didn't know she was pregnant until she was around 22 weeks, and that day happened about a week before. Now, when our youngest was born, she had delivered a second full placenta, and since was between Paris and Longview, Texas, trying to get me in my truck home that night, she felt it was better not to tell me. Now, when we named our youngest, my wife didn't want our unborn daughter to not have a name. So she named her Allison, or so she would have been affectionately remembered by Allie. I haven't talked with many people about these events, and I'm sure many will believe I'm faking the validity, as it was a very personal experience in both. But paranormal isn't something that can be explained. I can't explain how either event happened. I just have to live with the memories of them and the tears for those I lost. So this next witness states, I've had a weird time loop distortion of reality happen to me while driving. It was Christmas night of 2016, and I was headed back home around 9 p.m. To get home, I must take this back road through the countryside to get up to the foothills of the Sierras where I live. I had a strange feeling come over me, but I shrugged it off as just me being scared since I have had many UFO encounters in the past. The road was desolate. I remember on the wide blind turn that I passed an oncoming car, then continued for about a mile and a half up toward the traffic light at the college. As soon as I climbed a slight hill up the straightaway where the traffic light was in view, I instantly noticed that the light wasn't there like normal. Then, in an instant, I ended up back on the road right before the wide blind turn a mile back I had just already driven. This time, no car passed by me as I went through the turn, and the clock minutes never changed, like kept ticking forward. As far as I know, I experienced no missing time throughout the whole event. Now, when I ended up back on the road where I had just driven all over again, I felt as if I had just thrown into the car. I felt strange. My body felt different, as if I had an out-of-body experience and my legs shook uncontrollably. I could barely operate the pedals. I was very scared because I had never had anything like this happen to me before, especially on a desolate road at night. The only thing I can think is that I ended up in some temporary time loop where I was abducted with no missing time, and they put me back on the road a mile and a half earlier. Then me driving the same stretch of road twice. But I can't figure out why the traffic light wasn't there when it should have been, nor why it was the trigger to put me backward on the road. The second time the light was there as normal when I drove back up the hill, but so far I have no clue why this happened. Again, this occurred on Christmas night 2016 in Northern California. Now, I will tell you, I just thought of something. Christmas night of 2016, and I'll have to go back and dig this out, but I specifically remember that day and year. There was a lot of missing time events throughout the world. And it's never really been explained, but I have received from that same night. So I don't know if it's related or not, but that is interesting. And I don't know why I even thought about it until now. So strange. Now, this next account, a Pennsylvania man and his friend drive to Hocking Hills State Park in Ohio. They encounter and experience a few odd moments while hiking a trail. Now, the witness states, to whom it may concern, I'm writing this to you to add it to your many varied collections of paranormal and odd phenomena reported daily. I am a 29-year-old male from Pennsylvania, and I have read through several stories on your site. I thought I would share with you and your readers one of the many strange things I have personally experienced, and like other people, I would like to know if they too had this type of experience. In September 2008, my best friend, Sierra, and I went to a park named Hocking Hills in Ohio for a day retreat from our busy lives. She and I had decided on this at random when we first got together early in the morning, just after sunrise. It was a nice, warm, late summer day, and we just decided to make a full day drive and make a hike out of it. Now, Hocking Hills is well known for several walking trails, a cave or two, and several waterfalls and running water creek areas. The day was very warm and sunny, with hardly a cloud overhead and very nice. And Hocking Hills is also known for a lot of paranormal activity as well. We started a walk at random and found that one of the trails had been washed out, so we had to take another path, which forced us to cross a road. On the other side was a tall fire lookout ranger station, which doubled as a fire tower. We had seen a lot of people out walking with us that day, and a few hikers and backpackers had passed us by on their treks up until that point. We played with our phones a bit on the way to show each other some pictures we had taken a few days before on a different outing, and noted it was roughly after 12 noon when we came out of the woods and walked across the road. It was then that we noticed that there was a caution tape all over the fire tower, and there was a pungent smell in the air which we couldn't identify. The windows at the top of the tower appeared to be taped up, grimy, and there were flies all over the area. We walked past it, commenting how odd it was, and continued down a seemingly new trail we hadn't seen in a previous walk in the area. The trail took us past the fire tower and then cut into the woods as we walked into the forest. We took notice that no one seemed to be around. In fact, not only did we feel isolated from others, but we felt very warm as we both wore very cool clothing, and when we entered the forest, it began to feel very cool, much cooler than we expected. And we both were shivering as we felt the temperature drop. So as we continued down the way, my friend pointed out that it was getting darker than either of us should have expected or seemed to be. We looked around and there was nothing but trees on all sides. There should have been a forest edge somewhere, as the area wasn't really that big, because aside from some hills and tall pine trees, there wasn't a real ending to the woods like we expected, as the area tends to be narrow and normally you can see the edges. She took out her phone to use her GPS because she instinctively felt lost, but her battery was nearly gone. I took mine out and had no signal, and the battery was also near dead, showing 4 E's for the time, digital time. It was only then, as the light grew dimmer as we continued our way, that we noticed it very slightly suddenly. Our footsteps echoed. The leaves, grass, twigs, and our breathing just echoed. Sierra got spooked, and I did too. She mentioned it was very out of the ordinary. I agreed, but I couldn't shake this sense of foreboding that something was amiss. I tried to rationalize it, but I really honestly couldn't figure any of it out at all. We continued forward, going down a small hill on the trail and back up when it got darker. The world seemed to have gone from shadowy to near twilight darkness. My friend grabbed my arm and started freaking out about how weird it had got. Then the air grew chillier and had a feeling of something was wrong. We both took off running, looking for an exit. For some odd reason, we never thought of turning around at all. As we ran, we could hear our steps echoing off the area as things just felt like they grew more gloomy. Then ahead of us, down a small hill and back up the other side, we could see two large bushes on either side of the trail like a gate. We made a mad dash for the bushes, and just as we pushed through the plants, something odd happened. We were nearly blinded by light as sound and warmth returned all at once. It was like stepping outside of a cold, empty, and dark building onto a warm, busy street. We stood at the edge of the place known as Old Man's Cave, which has a large waterfall and a U-shaped cliff where we could look down into where the water and people gathered. We turned around. The bushes were the same, but the area was different, brighter, not silent for sure, and warm. In fact, our skin was cold to the touch, which just reinforced the facts. We took out our phones and the time had finally updated. It was now 4 p.m. The normal trail would have only taken an hour to walk fully, so there was a loss of 3 full hours. Now, logic attempted to set in, and we decided the trail we came up with must have just appeared creepy because there were so many clouds overhead and a storm blew by. But when we went back between the bushes, there was no trail. Nothing looked like it had happened a few seconds ago. Sierra walked around the bushes twice, and it was the same bright sunny day with no darkness and no trail. We waited. It was blue sky overhead, and we could see the edges of the forest and the other people. The trail had simply vanished as if it had never walked it. On returning past the trail where the fire tower was located, we noticed it was normal looking, and there was a blonde-haired young lady with her hair in a ponytail climbing the steps. The windows were not taped and very clean, and no pungent smell. We don't know what it was, but it was certainly creepy. Of course, I jokingly told her later that day over dinner that we had entered into the fairy realm by mistake and were lucky to get away. She didn't find that funny, of course, but either way, we felt we should share this with you, and if anyone out there had a similar experience, perhaps they can provide insight. Now, this next account, a bizarre account involving a boy and his classmates who shared a ride on an elevator in the New York State Museum. The event includes a time slip and alternate reality. Now, the witness tells me, after hearing story after story of strange encounters with strange men dressed in black suits, I wanted to tell a story from my childhood that to this day I have been unable to explain. This took place in 2001 when I was 8 years old. It was summer, and I was on a field trip with my town's community center daycare program. We were at the New York State Museum in Albany, New York. I was in a group with maybe 2 or 3 other kids and one of the daycare workers as a chaperone. Now, we got there in the morning and were told we could roam around the museum with our group until either 12 or 1 when we had to meet back with everyone for lunch on the 3rd floor. Our group walked around looking at all the exhibits, and after a while we realized we had lost track of time. We only had a few minutes to get up to the 3rd floor for lunch and attendance, and we were on the other side of the museum from where the elevators are. We hurried quickly to the lobby and hopped into the elevator. Out of breath from the near sprint we had done to the lobby, our group piled into the elevator. We hit the 3rd floor button, and my chaperone said we had made it in time and that we still had a minute or so to spare. Then, as the doors were closing, an extremely well-dressed man walked into the elevator. He was wearing black shoes, a black suit, and white dress shirt, black tie, black leather gloves, and a black fedora, and was carrying a black leather briefcase. Now, at the time, I thought nothing of it, but I've always looked back at this and thought this was very odd, as it was summer and he was dressed for the dead of winter. As the man got on, I noticed that he kept his head down, almost as though he didn't want us to see his face. He quickly turned around, only then lifting his head. He just stood there with his back to us, and I don't remember ever seeing him select the floor. The elevator doors closed, and this eerie feeling seemed to be emanating from the man in black. We had left the lobby on the first floor, and were going up to the third floor, so the ride should have been maybe 10 to 20 seconds at most. The elevator's display showed we had arrived at the third floor, but the elevator didn't stop. The numbers just kept climbing, and we were all still moving. Now, I want to preface this by saying those elevators in the lobby only have access to 4 floors. To my knowledge, the museum only has 4 above ground floors. I'll talk a little more about that at the end. Now, at this point, it had been well over a minute since the elevator started moving, and the numbers on the display continued to climb, as did the elevator. That eerie feeling that had been seemingly emanating from this man was getting more intense, and the air in the elevator was beginning to get extremely heavy. This seemed to get more and more noticeable as we continued to go up. The higher the elevator climbed, the feeling turned from eerie to foreboding. I remember getting the feeling you get in the pit of your stomach when you know something bad is going to happen. Something wasn't right. The display was saying we had passed the 50th floor, and we were still climbing. Now, at this point, it had been around 5 minutes in the elevator. The atmosphere in the elevator had become almost unbearable. This heavy, ominous feeling was something I've never experienced since. The closest thing I compare it to is the feeling you get when you walk down a dark hallway after watching a horror movie. And even that doesn't begin to describe it. Suddenly, the elevator stops. There's a sudden shift in the atmosphere of the elevator. It went from this foreboding feeling to a feeling of impending doom. Then I remember almost panicking when I thought about what was on the other side of those doors. I was telling myself repeatedly that the buttons on the elevator don't go past the 4 floors, so there aren't any floors beyond that. So whatever on the other side of those doors can possibly exist. This whole experience can't possibly have happened. And when the doors open, I'll see all my friends from the other groups eating lunch and everything will be okay. But that's not what happened. And this is where things have always gotten fuzzy for me. I remember getting on the elevator with my group, the man walking in the elevator going up. But I can't remember my group being in the elevator after a certain point. I know it was at least 5 minutes from the time we entered the elevator before it stopped, and yet I can't tell you how much time passed when the elevator stopped and when the doors finally opened. I can remember looking at the display to see what floor we were on, but I can't remember what it said. I remember being frozen there with no sound or movement whatsoever. I remember feeling like if those doors opened, something bad was going to happen, to the point where I remember panicking inside my head, pretending that none of this was happening. But every time I opened my eyes, that sinister man was still standing there, as still as a statue. And then suddenly, the man who was responsible for all this, who had not moved a single muscle since the elevator doors closed, dropped his briefcase. Not even a second after the briefcase hit the ground, the doors of the elevator opened, and yet I can't remember what was beyond those doors. I have tried for the last 18 years to remember and have never been able to see it. I just remember it being white and bright. The man then calmly picked up his briefcase, tipped his fedora almost to bid us goodbye, and walked off the elevator. I then remember the doors closing and that ominous feeling is gone. And in an instant, we were on the 3rd floor and the doors popped open. Only then do I remember seeing the rest of my group on the elevator. All of them looked as terrified as I did, especially our chaperone. Looking out, I saw the rest of the kids and the chaperones from the other groups. We walked out of the elevator and had been expecting to be extremely late for lunch, but we had made it on time. This is impossible because we had initially reached the elevator a minute or so before lunch started. That encounter on the elevator lasted at least 5 or 10 minutes. I remember our chaperone pulling the other adults aside and assumed she told them what had happened to us on the elevator. I remember sitting at the table with my friends eating a pizza at lunch and the kids from my group and sharing the story of what had just happened, but no one was believing us. I remember the chaperone had avoided the subject for the rest of the day, and the other kids in the group seemed to have dropped it as well. I remember that I told my mom what had happened, and I've always felt as though she didn't believe me. But before writing this, I wanted to make sure that it really did happen since I was so young and it had been well over a decade since this happened, and that it wasn't something my mind made up over the years or maybe just a very vivid dream. So I asked my mom if she remembered me telling her about this, and she said she did. She remembers picking me up from the community center, and the second we got in the car, I had told her all about the man in black in the elevator going up all these floors, and even that he had dropped his briefcase. She said that she also remembers me telling her that he had said something to me, though she doesn't remember what, and I don't have any memory of him saying anything. So there's my story. 18 years later, I still have absolutely no clue who the man was, where the elevator took us, and what was beyond the doors where the man walked off, or anything that happened in the elevator. I just know that it happened. I have no idea how long we were in that elevator. It could have been minutes or even hours. But what I do know is that time seems to have been separate from our reality since no time had actually passed when we got to the third floor. Hopefully you have heard something similar or at least have an idea of what happened. I've gone through every explanation I can think of and none of them make sense. From not remembering correctly when the elevator we got on and perhaps getting in one somewhere else, but that's impossible for reasons I've listed in the paragraph below this. I've thought maybe it was a really vivid dream, but my mom remembers me telling her right after pick me up from the daycare, the day of the field trip. I've even considered a gas leak in the elevator causing us to hallucinate. The one thought that's always been in the back of my mind was that we got into the elevator and took a ride through another dimension. Just a little side note, I had a job with a catering company in the Albany area last summer, and one of the most common venues we catered was the New York State Museum. Over that summer, I rode probably every public elevator in that building, and even the cargo elevator they have, and not a single one I rode on had buttons beyond the fourth floor. So this next account, two young women were taking their friend home after seeing a movie. Now, after dropping their friend, they drove a bit, but suddenly they lost about 90 minutes of time. What had happened? So the witness tells me, it was the winter of 2013. I was 19 years old. I was driving out in the country, and my friend Megan and I were taking my friend Tiffany home after the movies. Tiffany lived in the middle of nowhere up in the hills about 30 miles outside of Waverly, Ohio. We dropped Tiffany off at her house at 11 p.m. We knew it was exactly 11 because Tiffany had an 11 o'clock curfew and we got her home just in time. We drove up the hill to Tiffany's house. She got out and we turned around and drove off back down the hill to the road. This was a small back road. A drive back to the main road took about 15 minutes and involved about 4 different turns. Now, looking back, Megan and I both remember driving for about a mile and making that first turn. Then suddenly I'm looking out the windshield and I see we're no longer on the same back road. We're back on the main road, almost to the highway, 20 miles from where we had just been. I looked over at Megan in the passenger seat. She looked like she was almost in a trance. I asked her, Megan, how did we get here? We're almost at the highway. She looked at me, tears in her eyes, and asked, what just happened? It was then that I looked down at the clock and it was 12:30. In a blink of an eye, nearly an hour and a half had passed and we had somehow traveled 20 miles. We drove the rest of the way home in silence, almost in shock at what had just happened. Days later, an image started popping in my mind. We're sitting in the car. It stopped in the middle of the road. We were both frozen, staring at the headlights and the road in front of us. We also have a vague recollection of something in the trees off the side of the road. Mega had similar memories. It's been 10 years and I still refuse to go back to that area. Now, I note here, well, the recurring memory may have been a clue as to what happened. Both experiencers were frozen in their seats staring at headlights. Were they suddenly transported into another reality, or was this a case of abduction by an unknown source? I guess you have to decide. But it does sound like lost time through an abduction, though they didn't have really any recollection of that. But that's not unusual. Sometimes an abduction will take many, many years to be realized by the individual or experiencer. Now, in this next account, a South Central Virginia teen is sitting on her porch when she notices a slit opening midair in the yard. She goes to explore, but the opening soon closes. Was this a peek into another reality? So the witness states, I had a weird experience when I was a teen back in the late 1950s in my family's rural home on a 2-lane highway in South Central Virginia. I was sitting out on the small front porch with my mom. We were doing nothing, just sitting in the sun. The traffic on the highway was usually infrequent, and now no cars or trucks had gone by for a while. It was extremely quiet. Our neighbors had come over, and I was talking to Mom. Our neighbors had come over and were talking to Mom. I lapsed into staring off into space, into the front yard, and smelling the pines across the road heated by the sun, smelling the flowers. I wasn't blinking, just staring. It wasn't sudden, but I happened to notice that the slit had appeared in the air and seemed to be parted just enough so I could see inside. Inside the slit was the same yard, the same world, but it was different. The sunlight was uniform and soft white, and nothing cast a shadow. I had the strong urge to go explore and hop down off the side of the porch to go through the slit. I looked back to make sure my mom wasn't watching me and reassured myself that she was still talking to our neighbor, although at that point, I could not hear their voices, although they were just a few feet from me. I turned back to the front yard to walk the couple yards and enter the slit, but it was gone. I think that openings or portals are only open for a very short time. I was just curious, but I wonder what would have happened if I had stepped through. Would it have closed behind me? I would have been one of those children that disappeared literally right off in the presence of the parents. I believe that they are anywhere where the conditions of solitude are just right and the veils can thin out. Now, of course, I've heard of these slits and tears into the veil opening and closing quickly. Is that why some people just simply vanish? Can we enter an alternate reality that easily? I think it's possible. Many of you are, I'm quite sure, familiar with the missing 411 books and reports. It seems to be a phenomenon that continues on, but with real no explanation. So this next account, Peggy, her husband Derek, and her 2 children moved to Clark's Beach, a small town on Conception Bay in Newfoundland and Labrador back in 2000. Now, Peggy always enjoyed the area until she had a frightening experience while picking berries in the woods near her home in August 2022. She tells me, I had an experience blueberry picking that left me scared to go back for a while. I still get chills thinking about it to this day. I always loved summer. Where we live, there are only 7 houses on our road with only 1 entrance. It's surrounded by trees. My yard had lovely wildflowers, strawberries, and cherry trees. My neighbor had a plum tree that the moose come out and eat every fall. Across from my house, there was a big piece of undeveloped land overgrown with trees and giant blueberries. It's one of my favorite spots to go. Every year I made a few trips across the road onto this small path until I came to the small clearing full of blueberry bushes. Every year was the same for years until it was just a little while ago. I remember I was waiting for my sister to come and visit. I said to my husband that I was going to pick a few berries while I waited for her, so I grabbed a buck and I was off. It was around 6 p.m. in late August, so it was starting to get a little dark earlier, but I figured I had plenty of time. Now, keep in mind, I can see my house and hear if my sister pulls into the driveway from where I was. The piece of land I'm on is maybe a couple of thousand feet. So there was picking one for me. So there I was picking one for me, one for the bucket. The berries were big, but today they were huge. I mean, I had never seen berries so big. It was blue all around. I kept picking and picking. I soon started to notice it was getting dark. Oh no, another big patch. Look at those, I said to myself. I couldn't leave, but no matter how many I picked, my bucket still wouldn't fill. Oh, it's just my eyes playing trick on me because it's getting dark. Keep picking, Peg, and you'll fill your bucket soon, I said. But suddenly, I got this strange silence come over me, and the air got a little colder. No wind. It got just so quiet. No birds, nothing. I couldn't even hear the highway. I can always hear the highway. I thought I was deaf. All I could hear was my heart, and I believe that stopped for a second or two. Everything started to go into slow motion around me. Suddenly, something clicked, and a voice said, "Get out of here now." I remember standing up and going, trying to go, and my feet felt heavy. I looked for the path, but I couldn't find it. I started to panic because I could see my house, but I couldn't find my way to it. The harder I tried to get through the trees and reach the road, the further away it would seem. It's like I was looking through something. I was walking on a treadmill in front of a big screen. I saw my sister's car pull into the driveway, but my husband talking to her on the step and calling out to let me know that she was there. But I couldn't call back. I tried and only whispered. I started to get scared. It was getting dark and I wanted out of those trees. I remember saying, "Not tonight, buddy, not tonight. Leave me alone. I'm not playing your games." The next thing you know, I'm out on the path and standing on the road in front of my house, unsure how I got there, but glad I was. Conception Bay, Labrador. It's very interesting. It's an interesting account. I have been there a few times, and I have heard of weird incidents there. My father was stationed in Goose Bay, Labrador during the Korean War. Now, he and others experienced a bunch of unexplained activities. There have been several Bigfoot encounters there as well. Goose Bay is a joint Canadian-U.S. military facility where special forces have trained. And some of the later unclassified training books mention incidents at Goose Bay, especially those involving Bigfoot encounters and how to react. I've seen the books. I had two of those manuals many years ago, but lost them when I had a fire in my apartment back in 2005. So we'll get one more account. In this account, the witness was hiking an old trail in western Oregon when it turned gray and blurry around them. The day turned into night as a hairy arm and hand emerged from the darkness. And the witness states, "On this trip, I decided to hike the old Mohala Indian Trail that followed the ridge tops from Saddle Blanket Mountain to Oak Ridge in Oregon, one of the Native Americans' favorite summer camps and trading centers. It was a beautiful August day. 2 days into the hike, I expected to be gone about 2 weeks, when literally out of the blue, the most terrifying thing had ever happened to me in my life occurred. It would change my perspective of reality forever. I was walking along the trail enjoying the strong breeze and bright sunshine when in the middle of a step, everything around me turned gray and blurry. The only way I can describe it is if suddenly I was looking through someone else's prescription sunglasses. I finished the step and started another. Every inch I moved forward, the darkness increased and the gray blurring turned into a jumble of shapes that made no sense. I then seemed to pass a barrier and everything seemed to return back into focus when my foot reached the ground on the second step. Everything around me had changed. Day had turned into night, and there was no wind. All the Douglas fir and pine trees had been replaced with thick jungle-like growth. The cold, thin mountain air was replaced with humid, thick air. There were no stars in the sky, but there was a diffused light that let me see everything clearly. However, I couldn't tell where the light source was. As often happens when the human body receives a massive dose of adrenaline, the entire incident appeared like it was in slow motion. Even though I was only there for a second or two, I had time to observe my surroundings. The silence was broken by continuous high-pitched screaming sound, and I was nearly overwhelmed with a sense of fear and danger. My momentum caused me to take one more step before stopping in my tracks. It was at this point I heard a whispered, "Gotcha," over my right shoulder. I couldn't tell if I heard it with my ears or inside of my head. The word wasn't directed at me, but something said the word quietly to itself. I was so terrified I felt my heart stop for a moment. That whispered word is what saved me. I opened my mouth and gasped in a huge gash of thick air and recoiled backward into the same footstep I'd entered wherever I was. As I threw myself backward, I looked over my right shoulder. A dark-colored, hairy right hand and arm were reaching for my throat over my shoulder. The hand had pale ivory spade-shaped fingernails. The nails looked clean and almost had a manicured look to them. The thumb was placed lower towards the wrist on the hand that's a human's. Both hands and arms were thin and powerful looking, and both were covered with thick, coarse black hair. I got a good look at it because the thumbnail grazed my neck, and it didn't break the skin as I moved backward. As I continued backward, the hand clutched where my neck had been a split second before, and it seemed to fade off into the distance as I returned through the portal. I took 2 more steps backwards, and everything reversed itself from what had just happened. The world around me became lighter. The firs and pines gradually came back into view, and by the 3rd step, I was back on Saddle Blanket Mountain. I continued to move backward in terror, and as I did, I observed that where I had just come from was a shimmering oval patch of air about the size of a large door. The woods behind it looked like they were underwater. Now, by the 5th backward step, the shimmering area seemed to just evaporate, and everything was back to normal. But then my lungs had nearly burst from the volume of air I had just inhaled during the huge gasp I had just taken. My body felt like it was on fire from the adrenaline surge. I spun around and ran back down the trail as fast as my legs could carry me, and didn't stop until I reached my truck. It took nearly 2 days to get that place and about 3 hours to get back. On my way home, I was absolutely horrified at the thought of what would happen if I had to drive my truck into something like that. It had been a trap, pure and simple. Whatever it was tried to kill me, somehow kept the portal hidden from me on the way in, and I didn't see it until my way back out. I had terrible nightmares for years and still haven't come to grips with what happened. My fingers are trembling and my hair is standing up at the nape of my neck as I write this. Severely shaken, I've read everything I could get my hands on about people who have mysteriously disappeared throughout history, and discovered several instances where people have vanished in plain sight of others. In quantum physics, people have a theory about parallel universes. So, folks, that's the last account. So if you do have some questions, please put them up there, and Mary will go ahead and put them up there for me to answer. Anna Boyle, Lon, when we wake suddenly and feel or see spirits, is there a place between waking and sleep? You know, I get that question a lot, or something similar to that. I think it very well could be. I think when we do wake, we do kind of pass some type of reality, or not necessarily a portal, but I think we can change realities, especially if we have a dream or something like that. I've experienced that. I don't know how true that is, but I think it's entirely possible. Anybody, another question? Nancy Malcolm, Lon, have many reports from experiencers you collected over the many years and have had them sent to you? Well, this is interesting. I've right now in my archives, I've got 22,000 posts. Now, I started this blog 20 years ago. I have weaned that archive, so I have thinned it out over the years. So there you go. Out of those 22,000, maybe 40% were written into me from witnesses and others from colleagues and other things I've picked up. Oh, and by the way, I did check how many page views I've had on the blog in the past 20 years, and I'm up to 47 million right now, which I find interesting. Next question. Jose Sanchez, I once outran an angry German Shepherd, and as I ran, I looked back at the dog and saw its paw swipe inches near my right back shoulder. Funny thing is that it happened in slow motion, and as its paw. Yeah, I've heard similar accounts. I think the adrenaline thing is also valid, where adrenaline will kind of slow things down. And I've experienced that to a degree as myself. So I think there is something to that. Next question. Dag Nammit, have you ever heard of a dark shadow that floats in the air, which turns into a black hole and tries to get behind you with these appendages and will try to grab you and pull you inside of it? I have heard this a couple times with people who have had shadow people attacks or accounts, or live in a home where there are shadow people. Shadow people are not a good thing, and they are dangerous, quite frankly. And but I have heard something very similar to that. So yeah, that does happen. It does show up in accounts occasionally. Next question. Kevin Emery, we could be creating parallel universes every time we have a thought. What are your thoughts on that? I just changed into a parallel universe thinking that myself. I think it could happen. The whole theory of parallel universes and alternate realities and time mysteries. It's it's something we've got a lot of theories about. In a lot of our investigations, we have seen some evidence that this very well could be true, but we are at a point where we cannot prove it at this point. As quantum physics becomes more and more reality and becomes more commercially available, I think that we will eventually get some answers to this. Hopefully we will. And if it does happen, maybe we'll start getting answers to other phenomena as well. Anything else? Johannes Roost. Lon, how many people disappear every year that could be attributed to these portals and time slips? I don't know if there's a real definite number, but there are at least hundreds every year. I mean, if not thousands. I hear all kinds of different things. There are many things that are written about. I don't know if we can really attest to what's going on, but I think there is something very paranormal, very supernatural about all of this. People just don't disappear. So, another question. Jose Sanchez, Lon, conspiracy be heard and smelled. Yeah, I do hear them. I don't smell them, but I know people who do get odors around spirits. It's just part of their ability. Yeah, I believe it is. Okay, folks. So I want to thank each and all of you for watching and chatting. And if you donated, it's truly appreciated. And your support is what makes all this possible. So please like, subscribe, and share. Now, if you have a sighting or encounter report that you'd like to be considered for the personal report show or posted on Phantoms Monsters, please feel free to forward to my email at lonstrickler at phantomsandmonsters.com. So until we meet again, stay healthy and safe, and have a good night. We'll talk next week. Bye.